Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christopher Mlauzi. I will be the program director for this lecture. And before we go into the program, I just want to advise of a few housekeeping issues. Those of you who are not members of UNISA, if you have not yet established, our bathrooms are right. You exit, and then you go to the left. We have bathrooms for our males and females, same spot, different entrances. And we have ladies who are outside. If you need anything, please just walk to them and ask for assistance. They should be able to assist you. May I request that we put our cell phones in a mode that will not disturb the audience. I'm not saying let's switch them off. We need to tweet, we need to do all sorts of things with our cell phones, but let's try and minimize the ringtone to a volume that would be acceptable. In terms of the lecture program, this lecture is scheduled for 2 hours. And as you can see, we are already behind by about 6 minutes. We'll try and catch up. I'm not even sure how much time the governor will require to deliver his lecture, but I know we're going to have him as the main speaker. We have decided to include a panel of 3 individuals who will give a reflection on the governor's lecture. And they will have a bit of time to distill the governor's lecture. And thereafter, we will then open the floor for questions and answers. I think the governor will be able to respond to a few questions. We are mindful of the reality that we are time constrained. The governor has a very busy schedule as well. So we will try and accommodate as many questions as possible. So in terms of the program, the person who should deliver the welcoming address on behalf of the Vice Chancellor is our own Vice Principal, Strategy, Risk, and Advisory Services, that is Professor Ketlan Dlovu. And I would like to welcome him to the podium, and let's give him a round of applause.
Thanks, Program Director, Professor Christopher Mlauzi, Professor Mukhale, Executive Dean of the College of Economic and Management Sciences, our esteemed keynote speaker, Mr. Leseja Kganyago, Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, our panelist, Ms. Annabella Bishop, Mr. Fanny Joubert, and Dr. Montfort Mlachila, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the UNISA Executive, and members of the UNISA family, members of government, political formations, civil society, and the business sector, President of the NSRC, Mr. Ozanai Masetese, and the members of the NSRC, as well as the student leadership of all political formations in attendance today. Leaders of organized labor, members of the media, fellow Africans, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my honor and pleasure this morning to speak on behalf of the Principal and Vice Chancellor of UNISA, Professor Makhanya, who is currently away on university business. For those of our guests who may not be aware, this is the second in a series of public lectures whose purpose is to contribute to the national debate on issues of importance and at the same time ensure that a wide range of opinions are heard and debated. The generation of an ongoing, unstoppable conversational momentum provides the necessary framework for stock-taking, provocation, engagement, deliberate disruption, and a timely call for action. We are proud and excited about making our contribution to that debate and you will therefore appreciate it when I say that it is a great honor and privilege to extend a warm welcome to all of you as our honored guests. I would like to note with much appreciation all the dignitaries and diplomats in our midst. I trust that the warmth of the greeting which we at UNISA extend to you this morning will reassure you of our truly South African and African embrace. You're all most welcome. It is a brave lay person, distinguished guest, ladies and gentlemen, who would dare to speak with any authority on the mandate of the South African Reserve Bank, especially the current environments of contestation and controversy. I am not that person, and so I will not venture my opinion on the subject, especially when we have in our midst the man himself, the foremost authority and the governor of the South African Reserve Bank. So perhaps in anticipation of the lively discussion that are likely to emanate from your lecture, sir, allow me to extend to you particularly warm and peaceful welcome to UNISA. Allow me to stick my farming adventures, as I say all the time, and assure you that as a university which just happens to be the largest on the continent, we are fundamentally committed to the freedoms guaranteed in our Constitution and in our Higher Education Act, which include both free speech and institutional autonomy. UNISA is not a mouthpiece for anyone. Rather, we are committed to ensuring that our institution remains a safe and a vibrant space for all voices and all views. As such, we believe that we play an important role in fostering the kinds of debates that will advance our national agenda and the flourishing of our country and the continent. At this historic juncture, only 2 months post-elections, we are deeply embroiled in a state of deep introspection and analysis, shaped by acute socio-economic and political challenges. And so this lecture is particularly appropriate. At a time when our political landscape is changing almost by the hour, if not the day, we need steady hands, quiet minds, and steadfast spirits in the leadership of our public entities. We believe that in the case of South African Reserve Bank, we have such caliber of leader in the person of Mr. Khanyago. Our own national challenges come at a time of great uncertainty and dynamic transformation globally. For the first time in decades, we are uncertain about our futures, fearful of the dawning rumblings of fascism, and in our case, deeply concerned about the role and function of the university and education itself in a world that is rendering knowledge and skills redundant faster than we have ever experienced before. We are carefully interrogating and managing that reality, trusting that we are making the correct choices for future generations of our students. So, we genuinely appreciate that in times of fundamental societal transformation, as it is currently the case, ladies and gentlemen, it is critical that we have anchors, reliable and safe touch points, and secure havens that will retain relevance and help us weather the storms. The South African Reserve Bank has a critical role to play as one such anchor and haven, and it is for this reason that monetary policy, inflation, and balanced and sustainable growth must be managed appropriately, not just in the context of here and now, but with an eye to the future and the security and well-being of our citizens. Just as our university has a mandate of teaching and learning, research and innovation and community engagement, so the Reserve Bank is required to achieve and maintain price stability in the interest of balanced and sustainable economic growth in South Africa. However, we are also aware that the interpretation of the mandate, the manner in which it should be executed, in fact, the very role of the Reserve Bank is currently contested. And so we are delighted for the opportunity today to hear the views and thoughts of the man in the hot seat. Mr. Khanyago sir, we look forward to what you have to share with us today. Welcome. And thank you very much, Professor Miller.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ndlovu, for your words of welcome. Without any further ado, may I request the Executive Dean of the College of Economic and Management Sciences, Professor Thomas Mohale, to introduce our speaker of the day.
Thank you, Program Director. Sorry. Vice Principal, Professor Ndlovu, members of the Diplomatic Corps, fellow academic staff members, both from UNISA and our sister institutions within Gauteng Province, our leadership of students, as well of organized labor here in UNISA. All protocol is observed, and good morning to all. It is a great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker this morning, Governor of the South African Reserve Bank, Mr. Lesetja Kganyago, recently reappointed for his second term, his first effective from November the 9th, 2014. Mr. Kganyago had been a deputy governor of the South African Reserve Bank since May 2011. In his role, he was responsible for a wide range of areas, including research, financial stability, bank supervision, financial regulatory reform, including introducing the Twin Peaks regulatory structure, financial surveillance, including taking responsibility for regulation of cross-border flows, risk management and compliance, and the functions of the South African Bank's Academy. Governor Kganyago has more than 20 years' experience in formulating public policy, having spent his time at the Central Bank and at National Treasury. During his time at National Treasury, a fundamental reform in the management of the national debt portfolio was completed, and he successfully steered several public finance and financial market reforms. Governor Kganyago has led South Africa's technical team in various G20 Ministers of Finance and Central Bank Governors meetings and summits, including the inaugural summit in 2008. He has chaired the IMF World Bank Development Committee deputies and the G20 Working Group on IMF Governance Reform. He was also the vice chair of the Financial Stability Board Standing Committee on Standards Implementation for 4 years. Currently, Governor Kganyago chairs the Committee of Central Bank Governors of Southern African Development Community and co-chairs the Financial Stability Board's Regional Consultative Group for Sub-Saharan Africa. He also chairs the Financial Stability Board Standing Committee on Standard Implementation. He was appointed as the International Monetary and Financial Committee Chairman, effective from 18th January 2018 for a period of 3 years. The IMFC is the primary advisory body of the IMF Board of Governors and deliberates on principal policy issues facing the International Monetary Fund. Governor Kganyago holds a Master's of Science degree in Development Economics from University of London, SOAS, and a Bachelor of Commerce degree in Accounting and Economics from this very university. It is therefore our pleasure, Governor, to welcome you to this university and to deliver your lecture.
Thank you very much, Professor Muhadi, and for all the protocols that you had dealt with. It made my job very easy, but to save myself the embarrassment, I will say a special word of welcome to members of the Diplomatic Corps, ladies and gentlemen. In a way, it feels like one is here for a supplementary exam. I was checking whether Christopher Tor would be in the audience, and I heard he was not around because my first assignment in the honors program here from Christopher Tor had something like, please explain Keynes' principle of effective demand without any use of graphs or equations. So I then realized that English is a very important language because then I couldn't hide behind the graphs. But today I would like to talk about the South African Reserve Bank's mandate, what it is, how we interpret it, and where we are in our national conversations about the South African Reserve Bank. Although central banking has a global reputation for being boring, in South Africa it has been getting a lot of attention. Much of this is welcome. It is largely a useful opportunity for improving public understanding of what the SAB does, while we at the SAB also learn and benefit from our interaction with people all over South Africa. However, some parts of the discussion are problematic because they distract us from pressing priorities. As Minister Mboweni, the finance minister, has pointed out, this obsession, to use his phrase, is getting in the way of a more fundamental discussion about economic growth, job creation, and dealing with inequality. This economy used to grow at 3 or 4% a year, but now it grows at about 1%. As we in the SAB have tried to communicate, the growth problem in South Africa is mainly structural in nature, beyond the reach of monetary policy. Monetary policy is not going to create the PhDs in engineering that we need for the fourth industrial revolution. Monetary policy is not going to produce the kinds of skills that we require to raise the potential growth rate of this economy. That is in the realm of structural reform. Monetary policy is not going to improve the health outcomes, neither is it going to improve the education outcomes. That's in the realm of structural reform, and that is what is required to raise the potential growth rate of this economy. There is an obsession about the fiscal stock that we have. So we have debates about land and the mineral resources beneath the land. The truth of the matter is that for the future economy, the greatest wealth of the country is not the mineral wealth beneath the soil, it is not the land, but it is that is in the heads of our young people, the know-how, and that is what we need to be investing in order to raise the potential growth rate of the economy. Monetary policy is not going to help us in that. Perhaps part of the problem in this discussion is that whenever we get a new gross domestic product statistic, the news bulletins and newspaper articles end up talking about what it means for the next monetary policy committee meeting. Given this pattern, you might well assume that interest rates have large growth consequences. But we need some perspective. If we reduce rates by 25 basis points, as we did, and there aren't no other reforms in the economy, our modeling tells us that growth will be about 0.1 percentage points higher 1 year later. That's all. Remember that when we cut rates, however, Borrowers have more spending power, but lenders have less. Exporters may do better from a weaker rand, but firms that use imports do worse. Investment may pick up, but that depends on long-term rates, not just the repurchase rate, in addition to many non-monetary factors. So, the growth effects of a rate cut are small, and if we, as a country, obsess about the sub and monetary policy as the only answer to our growth problems, we will fail to discuss the difficult but vital reforms that might actually rescue us from our growth malaise. Failing to get that conversation about growth going has further repercussions because it feeds the notion that the sub's private shareholding matters to the policy framework we have and the decisions made on policy. And again, this shareholding debate is more damaging to our economy than it should be. It sends a signal to investors both here and abroad that our macroeconomic framework is at risk, making the cost of debt higher than otherwise and undermining confidence. Who loses from all this? One of the biggest hits is to indebted households and the beneficiaries of public spending who pay the price for skyrocketing interest costs on our public debt as the resources to spend are squeezed. These very serious problems aside, the fact that South Africans want to engage with the sub and its mandate is welcome, and we applaud it. Of course, not everyone agrees with us 100% of the time. A certain amount of disagreement is normal in central banking, as in so many other things. Indeed, not only is public engagement and discussion of monetary policy appropriate, when it is based on evidence, it is something we encourage. In the old days, the central bankers did everything in secret, and any public statements were deliberately complicated. Nowadays, we try to be open and transparent. We have learned that monetary policy works better with communication, and economy is populated with people. If these people understand what the central bank is trying to do, they adjust their behavior, which in turn helps the central bank to achieve its policy goals. Furthermore, we appreciate that having independence creates a duty to be transparent and accountable. We are not and do not want to be exempt from democratic principles. This talk is a contribution to the discussion on our mandate. So, let's talk about the mandate of the SAP. The Constitution, in Section 224, instructs the South African Reserve Bank to protect the value of the currency in the interests of balanced and sustainable growth in South Africa. The mandate reflects an understanding that protecting the value of the currency is a critical foundation for achieving lasting growth. Clearly, the mothers and fathers of our Constitution did not want us to let inflation run. We might have got more growth, but it would have been unsustainable. As many countries have discovered, after a temporary boom, we would end up in stagflation with weak growth and high inflation. The framers of our Constitution also cared about macroeconomic imbalances, which might, for example, result from a debt boom, or if we spend well in excess of what we produce, with imports running too far ahead of exports. The Constitution tells us what to do, but it is not explicit about how we do it. We had to figure out a monetary policy framework for ourselves. In fact, it took us a few years to arrive at the approach we use now. The Constitution was passed in 1996, but we only started inflation targeting in 2000. After a false start using the so-called eclectic approach to monetary policy that included a failed attempt to control the exchange rate. The inflation target, agreed between the South African Reserve Bank and the National Treasury, was initially set at 3 to 6% before being shifted to 3 to 5%. The emerging market crisis of 2001 led to the reinstatement of the 3 to 6 target, and it has remained since then. More importantly, the target created a clearer framework for decision-making and enhanced public understanding of the SAP's monetary policy objectives. But this choice of target also left important questions open. In particular, because the 3 to 6% what we ended up using is a wide range, it created uncertainty about the SAP's true objectives. I recall that a consultant helped us with some educational material, including for our website for public education. And the consultant wrote that with a 3 to 6% target, the SAP could cut rates when inflation was under 3% and hike rates when it was over 6%. That was a logical interpretation, but it was completely wrong. The fact is that during the inflation targeting era, the SAP has not seen targeted inflation below 3%. We have nonetheless cut rates on many occasions. In fact, these rate cuts have typically happened when inflation was over 5%, already in the top end of the target range. Various analysts and academics have spent a lot of time trying to estimate the SAP's de facto target, and they have tended to conclude it has been close to 6%. They were right. 4 years ago, we took a critical look of our monetary policy and reflected on our shortcomings. We realized we had let underlying inflation and inflation expectation drift to the very top of our target range. This wasn't a problem of supply shocks or demand shocks. It was a problem of the trend inflation rate. The analysts and academics, of course, were right. We had ended up with a 6% target. This meant we had a high inflation rate relative to other countries. We found that about three quarters of other countries had lower inflation than us. In addition, with normal inflation already near 6%, every new adverse price shock would push us outside of the target range. This would force us to act rather than to be flexible, or would cost us credibility, ensuring a higher inflation rate. To make matters worse, because everyone was used to inflation around 6%, indexation had set in. Prices and wages across the economy were locked in to grow at this 6% pace. This left us in a trap. Nominal interest rates had to be high because inflation expectations were anchored at around 6%, but high interest rates meant there was always pressure to cut. Meanwhile, the indexation bias meant that inflation never fell much, and so in turn, interest rates stayed structurally high. The paradox is that we have often been accused of being hawkish and keeping inflation rates too high, when in reality, we have often tolerated as much inflation as we can, ignoring the bottom half of our target range. This is the main reason why our interest rates have not fallen further. We tend to spend a lot of time comparing ourselves to low inflation and low interest rate economy when we really are not in that particular picture frame. Given this analysis, we decided to make some changes. We could better achieve permanently lower interest rates if we were clearer about where exactly we want inflation to be within our inflation target range. The simplest and most honest option would be to emphasize the middle of our target range, 4.5% as our goal. By analogy, we began to think of the 3 to 6 target range as the lines on a road. So when you are driving down the road, you try to steer between the lanes. You don't drive along the yellow line or on the center line. unless you are a bad driver. Of course, you can't keep the car dead center in the middle of the road all the time. But every time you start to drift towards the lines, you correct, aiming back for the middle of the lane. For monetary policy, 4.5% midpoint is the middle of the lane in this metaphorical road. And the 3 to 6% are the lines within which we must drive our car. When we decided on this adjustment, we were aware that using interest rates to move inflation expectations from the top of the target to 4.5% could be costly. For this reason, we started with some communication, expressing our preference for inflation expectations moving towards 4.5% over time. We also began more detailed work on the sacrifice ratios, which is the term us economists use for how much growth it costs to lower inflation. These exercises generated a range of estimates, but broadly speaking, they suggested we would have to do a series of rate increases, lifting the repo rate to 8% or higher to get inflation to 4.5%, assuming everything else in the economy remains equal. The estimated output sacrifice ratio was in the range of 1 to 1.5% of GDP. However, whilst we were studying this problem, a fortunate thing happened. Inflation began to slow, falling to around the middle of the target range by the middle of 2017. This occurred mainly because of positive supply shocks. In particular, food price inflation declined to unusually low levels, around 3%, compared with a long-term average nearer 7%. The exchange rate also stabilized. After depreciating every year from 2011 to 2016, it began trending sideways, which helped to moderate inflation for imported goods. We also like to think our communication made a difference. People were seeing inflation around 4.5%, and they were hearing the SARB say that's where we planned to keep it. So they used that information in setting prices and wages. All of this happened without us having to adopt a tight policy stance. We started with the repo rate at 7%, and we never had to go above that. Put simply, we got a good opportunity to get inflation lower, and we used it. Did we do the right thing? Again, I appreciate that informed people disagree, and these are good faith disagreements. People who understand economics and genuinely want what is best for South Africa take different views. But let me make 2 points about our decision. First, what we are doing is completely consistent with our target and our mandate. Some people tell a story that in February 2010, there was a letter from the Minister of Finance changing the South African Reserve Bank target, and how the SARB is now ignoring that letter. It is strange for me to be told what that letter was about. Because at the time, I was the Director General in the National Treasury under Minister Pravin Gordhan. So I should know the content of that letter, for nothing goes to the minister without the approval of the Director General. That letter did not establish a new target close to 6%. Rather, it reaffirmed the 3 to 6% target range, and it reaffirmed the SARB's practice of pursuing this inflation target in a flexible manner. Flexibility means the SARB should avoid excessive volatility in growth and interest rates. In other words, if an inflation shock moves inflation outside of the target range temporarily, the SARB does not have to hike interest rates to return inflation to target immediately. The SARB just needs to do enough to get inflation to return to target over time. The minister's letter specifically recognized that inflation expectations need to be anchored, and that well-anchored inflation expectations under credible monetary policy are good for growth. The approach we are taking now, emphasizing the 4.5% midpoint, is our best attempt at implementing the 3 to 6% target framework optimally. As I have noted earlier, the SAP and the National Treasury had originally agreed to lower the target range to 3 to 5%. With hindsight, and this is perfect, by postponing it to some unannounced future date, we made a terrible monetary policy mistake. We should have announced we would get to 3 to 5% more slowly instead of reverting back to the 3 to 6%. We learn. If we reformed the target now, in consultation with the National Treasury, we would likely go to either 3 or 4%, with a tolerance band of maybe 1 percentage point on either side. Why? Because this is where most of our peer emerging markets are already, or where they are heading. For instance, this is where inflation targets are for Brazil, Chile, China, Colombia, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Russia, and various other peer countries. But we never reformed our target. So we are still using 3 to 6%, and we are making policy target that range as best we can. The second question I would like to tackle is whether emphasizing 4.5% is an optimal monetary policy for South Africa. My view is that this is a key macroeconomic accomplishment. We have positioned South Africa to have permanently lower inflation. This is valuable progress. Critics will say, we could have cut rates to get higher growth. But as I have noted earlier, South Africa's growth problem is caused mainly by structural factors like a constrained electricity system as well as policy uncertainty. Given these constraints, a monetary policy that tolerated higher inflation for the sake of more demand would have yielded at most relatively small and temporary benefits at the price of long-term costs. As an exercise, we have modeled what would happen if the MPC started aiming for a 6% target again. If we cut rates by about 100 basis points, growth would be half a percentage point higher at its peak, and about a third of a percentage point higher the year after that. That isn't much growth, and certainly not a game-changing growth recovery. The exchange rate would depreciate, the output gap would close, and inflation expectations would start shifting higher. Core inflation would hit 6% after about 2 years. By around this point, growth would slow once again. There would be no permanent increase in output. Interest rates, however, would be permanently higher, underline that, would be permanently higher given the implicit 6% target. Higher inflation begets higher interest rates. Higher inflation begets higher interest rates. If the country needs long-lasting, low interest rates, then we must have lower inflation. This last point is something you should bear in mind whenever you hear someone arguing for a higher inflation target. Many of you are students, so it matters for you as much as for anyone else. A higher inflation target would mean higher interest rates. Over the short term, 1 or 2 years, tolerating more inflation can allow a looser stance. But this effect is temporary. If we decide to tolerate more inflation now, by the time you graduate and go to work, you are going to face higher interest rates. Your student loan repayments will be higher. A car repayment will just be a dream. A mortgage will be costlier. All these will have real implications for your income. This does not mean the SARB should avoid all rate cuts. Rather, we should avoid cutting if the price of doing so is permanently higher inflation. We cut rates if we feel confident we can keep inflation under control over time. Our modeling framework balances growth and inflation over the medium term using a Taylor rule developed by Stanford economist John Taylor. And if the model sees growth underperforming the economist's potential, the rule suggests a loser, a monetary stance. If inflation is simultaneously higher than the target, it compromises, aiming both to hit the inflation target and to move growth back to potential over the forecast period of 2 to 3 years. Given this process, the MPC decided to reduce rates at its July meeting because growth is underperforming and inflation appears to be under control. So this is one responsible way to cut rates. Rates could be cut because inflation is lower and is expected to be lower over the forecast horizon. You may wonder why we say growth instead of employment. After all, this is the challenge we face as a country. Of course, the two are linked. Better growth generates more jobs. But we do not refer to employment because of technical issues with our employment data making them difficult to interpret. For example, despite the negative GDP growth in the first quarter of the year, the quarterly employment survey told us that the economy had created an extra 49,000 jobs. That was probably not a signal the economy was picking up. Unfortunately, the data throw up these kinds of puzzles all the time, making it hard to rely on them as guides for monetary policy. At a more fundamental level, it doesn't make much difference if we use growth or employment in our Taylor rule, a point made by academics assessing our policy decisions. They find that the SARB cares about jobs as well as growth and does not behave as if it cared about inflation and nothing else. This is the hard evidence. We can also measure our policy stance with reference to something called a neutral real interest rate, which in recent years has increased in the case of South Africa. This makes it more difficult to cut rates without inducing inflation. A part of the rise in our neutral rate has come from the higher global rates, which affect us because we have to borrow from foreigners to finance our current account deficit. A larger part of the rise comes from an increasing risk premium. The risk premium is the price that lenders demand for putting their money here in South Africa instead of somewhere else they perceive as safer. Our risk premium has increased by about 3/4 of a percentage point over the past 5 years. If risk subsides again, perhaps because we borrow less or invest more to grow faster, we will have more monetary space and might cut rates responsibly. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, let me make a point frankly. We don't have balanced and sustainable growth in South Africa. With annual GDP growth rates under 1%, we barely have any growth. Indeed, adjusting for the increase in our population, we have been getting poorer for half a decade. We also don't have balance or sustainability. Government's debt to GDP ratio is moving steadily higher, and with bailouts for state-owned enterprises, there are real risks we will soon have one of the highest debt levels amongst our emerging market peers. Because we have borrowed so much from abroad, we pay a rapidly rising amount of interest to non-South African creditors. And this is contributing to a large current account deficit. Again, one of the biggest in our peer group. There are limits, real limits, on what monetary policy can do to help. By anchoring inflation expectations at lower levels, we lower long-term interest rates, supporting investment and helping government to finance a growing debt burden. By maintaining a credible monetary policy and a short-term interest rate that compensates investors for risk, we help to maintain capital flows into South Africa. Our repo rate setting is accommodative relative to our estimate of neutral, and it is low compared with historical averages. Rate cuts, like the ones we have just decided on, provide some help on the margin, but inflation shows few signs yet of further moderation. There is a healthy debate about where exactly we need to go with the repo rate, but we see no monetary policy stance that would single-handedly transform South Africa's growth prospects. And as our economic circumstances get more difficult, I worry that more people will choose to avoid making hard choices and pretend they do not need to be made, as if the SAF could just cut rates enough and we will all be happy after. The facts are, central bankers care about growth and employment, and the South African Reserve Bank is no exception. But we do not face a permanent trade-off between inflation and growth. There are short-term trade-offs involving growth, but after a while, inflation and interest rates are the things that permanently increase. The SAP can deliver low and stable inflation, but balanced and sustainable growth also requires contributions from many other parts of government and society. As a country, we need to maintain prudent macroeconomic policies, and we have to make further progress on a range of structural issues. Ultimately, prosperity cannot be created by an MPC setting interest rates. We are but one part of the orchestra. We are not the soloists. We are doing our best, but we can't put on a show alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. I must say, I listened to the governor very attentively when he said we cut rates if we believe we can control inflation over time. Please pardon me, I stopped economics at level 3 in my undergraduate degree. And I'm tempted to believe that when I was tasked with this role, those who put me in the program, they knew that I'm not going to comment on the lecture of the governor. Ladies and gentlemen, we invited a broad range of entities. And I can tell you we have a diverse audience that includes people like me who are not really specialists in economics. And we would like them to benefit from this lecture. As a result, we decided to have a panel that will give a reflection on the governor's lecture. And I'm not going to bore you by reading the profile of the panelists. You can look at that at the back of your program. We have Dr. Montfort Mlachila, who's the resident representative of the IMF in South Africa. He's the senior resident representative of the IMF. And we have Mr. Hubert Stephanus. I would like you to come over here, Mr. Hubert. You'll take my seat. I'll grab the chair on the other side. Then we have Mr. Hubert is a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics at UNISA. Then we have Ms. Annabel Bishop, who is the chief economist at Investec. These will be our three panelists who will give a reflection on what the governor has said, just to give the benefit to members of the audience who literally may not have understood what the governor has said, so that when we open the floor for questions, everybody has the benefit of asking a question. I will start off by looking towards Dr. Montfort Lachila, perhaps, and then we'll come towards Ms. Bishop, and then Mr. Hubert will conclude that. It's a 20-minute slot that we've put in, but I think the governor has been generous with time. He has given us an additional 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mlaut, and thank you for inviting me. First of all, I would like to start by congratulating the governor on this appointment, reappointment, I should say, as the governor of the SARM. I should be very careful as to how I say things here, because it's the clubus of my bosses at the IMF. But I'll try to be as direct and open as I can be with regard to the lecture. I need to emphasize, first of all, an important part of effectiveness of monetary policy. Monetary policy in any country can be effective if it is credible. And in South Africa, it has definitely been credible almost by any metric over the past 20 years. Inflation has become significantly lower and less volatile over the past 2 decades, and it is now solidly within the target range of 3 to 6%, and more recently it has actually been quite close to the midpoint of 4.5%. And crucially also, in terms of inflation expectations, these have actually become more anchored at a lower level than they used to be a couple of years ago. A few months ago, a colleague of mine, who used to be at the SARB, by the way, published a paper in the Journal of Economic Modeling, and we show in the paper that monetary policy credibility in South Africa has improved, and one of the beneficial side effects of improving monetary policy credibility is the lowering of the exchange rate pass-through, which used to be around 70% at the turn of the century to around 20% now. The SARB has undoubtedly done a lot of things to improve its monetary policy credibility, and crucially, as the governor said, it has maintained its monetary policy independence, which unusually so, unlike in a lot of countries, the SARB's independence is actually in the constitution, which obviously makes it very difficult to change. That, of course, doesn't prevent people from attacking it, but this is obviously a source of strength for the country, and in the current debates, obviously, a very, very useful thing. As a flip side of independence, as the governor rightly pointed out, the central bank needs to be accountable, and it needs to be transparent about its objectives as well as its policy stance. And in recent years, the monetary policy reviews, which the SARB publishes every 6 months, have become state of the art and are undoubtedly among the best in the world. And more recently, the central bank has become even more transparent in terms of its policies and its stance by publishing the quarterly projection model and the underlying assumptions, publishing the underlying assumptions as well as even the interest rate path. So this is obviously a very good thing, which has improved the monetary policy credibility and effectively communicating what it intends to do and how it intends to do is a very good thing for boosting accountability. And of course, today, the public lecture is a perfect example of that. Let me stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. To carry on with the sentiments expressed so far today, so certainly I think a very clear and well-rounded explanation from our Reserve Bank Governor on the monetary policy regime followed in South Africa, and I think, you know, a very clear approach, or perhaps just to go in depth in some areas and perhaps look at some of the points discussed so we can see exactly what he was talking about for some people perhaps who didn't follow all these points. Particularly, I just want to also talk about 3 points in South Africa that we've actually seen economic growth slow quite substantially. To start off, really having a look at South Africa, we've seen inflation drop from 6% to about 4.5% recently, and this is downward trend in inflation we've been discussing, and which has actually allowed inflation expectations to become quite solidified. People expect to see a low inflation rate going forward. We've seen a marked decline in salary and wage increases in South Africa as well. Those have also dropped down below 5%, and as a consequence, this has helped to anchor inflation expectations going forward. And indeed, I believe is one of the reasons why it has engendered an interest rate cut that we've experienced. And if this continues to be the case, may well see a further easing as well, depending on what happens internationally. We were talking about the risk premium earlier. Perhaps just to pause and talk about this risk premium, I believe it's very important to unpack it, and as we was discussing earlier. In particular in South Africa, if we look at our interest rate, perhaps at 6.5% as a central bank interest rate, we look at interest rates at other central banks in the world in developed economies, and they may well be closer to 1%, 2%, if not closer to 0%. Why would we not have our interest rate at such a low level? Why would we not put our interest rates down to those developed economies and indeed slash our interest rates quite now? I believe there has been some debate around this. And certainly one of which is ridiculous for foreigners to own our government bonds, certainly the amount of money they pay and holding income payments, and have a look at it and get about 50% of our foreigners. So if we were to slash our interest rates quite dramatically, that could have a significant impact on many areas of the economy, but certainly would have a negative impact on our exchange rates. We'll see a substantial appreciation of exchange rates, and not a very substantial disinvestment. And indeed, having looked at the exchange rate itself, it's very helpful us from a credit class perspective to see credit class being cut away. It's often to keep trades in the exchange rate. Very sharp appreciation of rand, which has occurred very substantially as a consequence of higher transport costs, feeding through into second-round effects as well in terms of higher costs of goods and services. And indeed, if we have a look at the fuel price, certainly it's been one of the key reasons why it's dropped significantly. Indeed, aid of inflation, though, has been due to lower oil prices internationally. That's not something that we can actually, it's not something that we can rely on. And so embedding inflation expectations in the economy is quite an important point as well, in order to keep stability, financial market stability, and indeed to actually act on keeping interest rates contained as well. Having a look at the government side, certainly looking at debt increase quite substantially over the past 10 years, if not more of that, and indeed seeing economic growth decline from 3% down to less than 1%. Certainly one of the key concerns has been a very substantial rise in government borrowing, and indeed causing longer-term interest rates to rise in the South African economy. If you have a look at savings and borrowings in South Africa, government is a large saver, a large borrower. Households have minimal savings, but corporates in South Africa have very high rates of savings. And if you have a look at the two, they actually sit on top of each other if you invert it. Really what we're talking about here, the corporate sector actually seeing a lot of funding shift away from it into government. And indeed the Basel regulations, banking regulations that have occurred over the last several years also assisted this as well. Indeed, the banks themselves obviously are in a position now where they have got a lot of corporate savings in their accounts, but indeed tuning these through normal banking operations, Basel legislation has required banks to hold a high level of government paper, government debt, treasury bills called high quantity liquid assets, and of course this has actually assisted in this massive rise in government borrowings. So where does this really leave us? Well, one of the factors is that course, as well, we've seen the crowding out of funding towards the private sector by pushing funding to government debt. Someone had to pay for this massive swelling in government debt. We heard earlier that only about 40% is from foreigners. A large portion came from South Africa as a consequence. So that also has seen a negative impact on economic growth. So bringing all these factors into account, you can see that through this refrain, there has been a well-managed monetary policy system at least, and that has provided stability in our financial markets. So that is the one key point I wish to conclude with, that we have seen well-run monetary policy, which is a system providing stability in a period where we've seen our government finances and indeed those of the SOEs balloon to such an extent that they have created instability and indeed resulting in credit rating downgrades.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the previous two panelists summarized a lot of the details, so I'm not going to go into the technical side. I think I'm going to be more the voice of academia if I can. And I think from our side, I want to thank the governor for almost confirming to us that what we are currently, between all of this rumblings that's going on in the financial news and in the public sector, that we are still teaching our students the correct rules and what's going on in monetary policy really. I think for us as academics, it's sometimes very difficult to sort of tread that line between, because monetary policy can quickly become almost a philosophical idea. And so yes, I want to thank you for confirming to us that we are still on the right track, or so we hope at least. Then also, I think what was interesting for me is I've looked at some textbooks, typical lecturer, but what I could find briefly was that the objective of monetary policy is to maximize social welfare. And I think that is an extremely difficult topic if you think about it. And again, I think the governor made it very clear that sort of balance that needs to be found between, for example, he mentions exports and imports and all of things like that. So it's an extremely difficult exercise. And then lastly, I just think also important at this stage is the whole idea about should we have very strict monetary policy rules or should we have more discretion. I think that is something, especially for academia, where we can debate a lot more. Again, the governor confirmed the use of the Taylor rule, which is but one of a lot of rules. I mean, other ones I can mention quickly is things like a monetary condition index, a financial condition index, a McCallum rule. Honestly, I don't even know any of them by detail, but those are a lot of the difficult things that academia also struggle with. And then lastly, just to confirm, I think what we really appreciate from academia's side is clear guidance related to the Reserve Bank. And I think one of my colleagues is working on a paper where he's working on especially three aspects of the Reserve Bank, which is the mandate, the ownership, and the independence of the Reserve Bank. And I think purely from a theoretical perspective, if we can just at least get the theory right and where we are heading with those three, I think it's already a step in the right direction. So I thank you very much, and thank you to the governor.
Can I test with our panel members? Do you still want to say something, Dr. Mlachila?
Yes, I just wanted to re-emphasize one further point in terms of, at the beginning I did say the South African Reserve Bank has definitely gained a lot of credibility over the past 2 decades. This does not mean that it cannot do more and cannot do better. Undoubtedly, there is scope for doing more, and the governor already alluded to that. Inflation still remains relatively high compared to the rest of the world. As the governor said, it's around, South Africa now is around the top 70–75% of inflation in the world. When the inflation target was originally set, South Africa used to be around 25%. So South Africa has progressively drifted towards a relatively high inflation country. In other words, South Africa has become actually less competitive over time. And as we all know, inflation is particularly pernicious to the poor. And in South Africa, for example, the poor actually face, for the same average inflation, the poor tend to have relatively higher inflation, and obviously inflation erodes their income more than that of the rich. The rich can definitely defend themselves because they are mostly in the formal sector. What needs to be done, and the governor has already alluded to, is to have definitely a lower target rate for inflation. We have argued in some of our reports that to improve transparency and also to improve communication, it would be better to move to a single point target, perhaps around 4.5% or even lower, with tolerances, rather than having a range which tends to somewhat obfuscate the message. As the governor has again said, it's definitely the case that the vast majority of countries in the emerging market world have a single point target. So we think that would be the way to go going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our panel members. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that moment has arrived for questions from the audience. I wouldn't want us to do the questions answer session like a normal press conference. We have an audience in excess of 200 here, and if each one of the individuals was to ask a question, I'm sure we could sit here the whole day. So we would do the first round of 5 questions, and I would like to appeal to everyone that let us not smuggle other questions into a question, because people have a tendency of saying, but yes, this is a question and there are 3 questions in one. So let's try and limit our questions to one. I would like to open the floor now, and I will recognize 5 hands. There is a hand on my left, and there is a hand in the middle. These are the 2 hands I can recognize. There's a hand at the back. I recognize that hand, and there's a hand right in front. We have 4. Can we get the 5th hand? Ladies and gentlemen, one more hand. Are we? Okay, we got the 5th hand. So let's start in that order, by the order in which I recognized you. You just bring your question. The governor will take note of your question, and then we will respond to the first round of 5.
Thank you very much. My name is Pelan Pakhadi. I'm from Newsroom Africa. Governor, you know, as having been a person who reports a lot on politics, those numbers were just throwing me off a bit. But the one thing that I managed to make of in your conclusion, you talked about the bailout to state enterprises, saying we soon may have a heavy debt as compared to our emerging markets peers. So what is your assessment as SOEs now line up for these billions of rands from the coffers? Will that move perhaps having an impact on how the Monetary Policy Committee may in the future review the current state of our repo rate?
Next question. Is the mic not working? Can you try the neighbor's mic?
There we go. Hi, my name is Maputi from Investec. So, in the majority of the lecture today, it's quite clear that we are quite we're an economy that is fixated with interest rates because of our monetary policy regime, naturally so. So we inflationary driven, and the governor did also point out that we have a tendency to compare ourselves to other economies, essentially more developed economies with much lower interest rates and. So my question really is around, and Governor, I have no doubt that you have actually had this question before, that how possible and simple would it be for us to review our whole monetary policy regime? And I'm not talking QE, obviously, so I'm talking more like what other emerging markets have done previously, more fixed exchange rates, hard pegs, more along those lines, recognizing that not only would that put your job at jeopardy, because according to the impossible trinity, that means that we would lose complete independence of our monetary policy. But basically my question is, what is the possibility and how simple would it be really to start rethinking our fiscal and monetary policy to something completely different that is not so independent on inflation?
Thank you. Can we get the question at the back?
My name is Velim Tian. I'm from the SABC. My question is on I think the governor has just put clearly that there is a contestation where the politics is trying to get into the monetary policy space. But of course, it may be because of the growing populism in our politics. But I want to ask, what is it that the South African Reserve Bank is making in terms of public education and public awareness of the South African Reserve Bank mandate, independence, and ownership? Because there is this debate on the grass that if the private shareholding of the Reserve Bank is not prudent for those who are investing in the Reserve Bank in monetary terms, so what is it exactly that interests, that keeps the ownership of the Reserve Bank in the private hands? Is it trying to take it away from politicians who might want to meddle into the monetary policy? That's my question. I hope I'm clear.
Thank you. We have a question in front here. Just, okay.
My name is Brian Scanlon. I'm from the University Institute. My question to the governor is relating to the twin peaks regulations of financial industry. Would it complement its nature, perhaps slow down the speedy implementation of solutions to a banking crisis? And is the twin peak system really better than what we had before, when control of the banks was solely in the hands of the Reserve Bank?
Our last question for this round. Thank you very much. Then the governor will take to the podium to answer all the questions, and then we'll do the next round.
Thank you very much for those questions. They were not in the question paper that I was given. Newsroom Africa, the story about the SOEs. We're not interested in the individual SOEs. From a monetary policy stance, what we are looking at is how does this affect on the macro. Rising debt will have an impact on country risk premia, and if it has got an impact on country risk premia, it changes the neutral real rate, and if it changes the neutral real rate, that means that the domestic policy settings will have to take cognizance of the higher neutral real rate that you get. We do not get into the individual ones. It's the other governor number 8 who has to worry about that. Thanks, it's not for me. Maputi, yes. Maputi way. The review of the monetary policy regime, of course, things can always be reviewed as long as you defined the end. But in doing the review, we must also try and think where we had come from. Whichever monetary policy regime you choose, whichever one you choose, a central bank will be concerned about price stability. Doesn't matter which one you choose. So let's jog your memory a little bit. So we used to have monetary policy almost made in Bundesbank. During those days, what was popular was what was called money supply targets. So the targets would be said that if money supply grows by this rate, credit by this rate, then inflation would be under control. And then very soon they stopped being called targets, they started to be called money supply guidelines. And as a 30-year UNISA student in economics, one of the papers on monetary theory involved you having to understand the various components of money supply. And it was a regime that was followed in South Africa. So a question was asked to the seventh governor of the Reserve Bank, Dr. Chris Stals. He was asked, Dr. Stals, why have you abandoned money supply targets as your monetary policy framework? He says, we never did. The money supply targets abandoned us, which meant that that framework was no longer working. Elsewhere in Latin America and in Asia, countries would be obsessed with the exchange rate. And they say that this is the exchange rate, it's pegged. The Asian pegs were not hard pegs, they were crawling, which means that it moved all the time. And if that is a monetary policy anchor, it's fine. The theory behind it is that you have anchored the exchange rate, and because you have anchored the exchange rate, then the inflation rate will be contained. But for you to do that, you need very deep pockets. You need lots of reserves to be able to defend the peg. And so one of the things when I got into the Reserve Bank in 1994 was to be a foreign exchange trader. And very soon you learn that actually these so-called speculators, you can't speculate against the market, you will lose. If you are a trader, the only institution you must speculate against is the central bank. You are guaranteed to win. Because central banks which are targeting the exchange rate think they know what the correct exchange rate is, and the pages of economic history books are filled with central banks with scars all over that tried to do it and couldn't succeed. South Africa was no exception. We tried. And $28 billion later, it was a very expensive economics lesson. I can tell you, I don't know how many students we would have put through UNISA to study economics with that amount of money. But $28 billion later, in an oversold forward book, we eventually came to the conclusion the exchange rate is not something central banks control. And at the time then, we said the Constitution says that our responsibility is price stability. That is what we must focus on, and that should be the anchor of monetary policy. And hence we came with the inflation targeting framework. In the US, there is a review of monetary policy at the moment, but the review is not whether they are focused on inflation or not. The review is on the execution and the communication around monetary policy. So We might have a review, and the review will go, I can write the conclusion for you now. After considering all the alternative regimes, we have come to the conclusion that the inflation targeting framework as currently practiced by the South African Reserve Bank is a superior framework, and we should continue with it. That will be the end of the review. SABC, public education, I agree with you. And I had actually found that it's not just the ordinary public. It's also the people who carry the information to the public that also needs to be educated about these things. And hopefully this lecture would have benefited those who are here, and we could spread the message. There are a couple of things we do at the moment at the Reserve Bank. We do something called the MPC Schools Challenge. We started this with a few provinces, and last year we now covered all the provinces. This is how it works. The theory behind it is that every learner that you reach out at school, when they leave and they get home, they can carry the message. And so the MPC Schools Challenge organizes the schools, and these schools constitute themselves into MPCs, Monetary Policy Committees, and they formulate their own monetary policy stance, and they must come and present, and they compete against each other. We had found it to be a very useful action learning exercise. They are backed up by academic resources that help them do these things. And we were amazed. I mean, at some stage we had, the schools, they come and they present in PowerPoints and so forth. And one of the schools which happened to come from a rural area, which obviously clearly they didn't have access to PowerPoint, they were using flip charts. And yet they were able to communicate their message so clearly. So that is the one. So we do have the outreaches, and we try to do all of those things. The problem is, the issue is not that general public. It's the chattering classes. And they know that they are deliberately confusing the real message. They know they are confusing the real message. So you talked ownership and all of that stuff. The professor here says that one of his colleagues is coming with a paper. That will be useful, probably be very useful. It will be dispassionate. Academics, they've got academic freedom. So they can say anything they want. Okay? As long as it is consistent with the standards of inquiry at the university. And so they can say these things. And maybe that would be a very useful exercise. There's discussion about, you said ownership. There is no private ownership of the Reserve Bank. There isn't. There are private shareholders, but they do not own the bank. Why am I saying so? Those of you who understand shares, a company is owned by ordinary shareholders. And ordinary shareholders can vote in their AGM, they can vote to say, we declare a dividend of this much. Those sub-shareholders can't declare a dividend. The dividend is written by law. It's fixed in law. It's 10 cents per share. So it's a no-brainer. This debate about ownership is a 200,000 rands per annum debate. That is all it is. So we are engaged as a nation in a debate about a group of people who are getting 200,000 rands a year. That's it. That's what that conversation is about. So you talked about ownership and mandate and all of that. You can kick away those private shareholders using whatever means, whatever you pay them, You can pay them. And whatever you choose to pay. My question to you would, whatever the amount you pay them, Why would you want to spend that money paying them instead of fixing a hospital or a school? Why would you want to be wasting money on that? It's the opportunity cost, but these things are done. But South Africans do not seem to also understand figures of speech. And let me try with this one. In ancient Greece, the Greeks wanted to capture the city of Troy. And they realized that the Trojan army was organized and they couldn't quite break in there. And the Greek came with this idea that they must offer the Trojans a present. And the present was a wooden horse. And the Greek put in that horse warriors, and they gave the Trojans the horse. And the Trojans were happy to have the horse. And once the horse was inside the city of Troy, Greek warriors came out and they captured the city of Troy. This thing about the ownership is like that Trojan horse. Because it is just about ownership. And now that the horse has entered the city of Troy, people are raising mandate, they are raising this, they are raising that. It was a Trojan horse. It is a distraction from a difficult conversation we must have about growth in this economy. Somebody tell me that by kicking out those private shareholders, we are going to have higher growth in this economy. We will have more people employed in this economy. We will improve education outcomes. We will improve health outcomes. How would you do it? By kicking out people who are taking 200,000 rents a year? On Friday, I will meet some of those people who get the 200,000 at the Reserve Bank. I've got an AGM with them. And if you happen to own some of those shares, you must come to that meeting. It's a very nice meeting. It's quick as well, because it only deals with two things. One, you will elect the directors, few directors, that the others are appointed by the president. You will elect any directors that are there. And two, you will then vote on whether we must approve this audit firm or not, and how much that audit firm must be paid. That's it. AGM done, and then we will give you very nice eats and drinks, and you can go home. That's all that those shareholders do. The Da Vinci Institute, the Twin Peaks legislation, the academic literature is unsettled about whether there is any particular institutional setting that is superior to the other. The UK experienced a global financial crisis. They had a single peak. The US experienced a financial crisis. They had multiple hits. Everything from the state regulator to the city regulator to the insurance regulator, they had all of those. What the Twin Peak does is that it regulates by regulatory objective. So the concern that you had about the speediness of resolution of any banking crisis would not change, because resolution is still the responsibility of the Reserve Bank and not of the other peak. So the prudential peak is within the Reserve Bank, and the resolution is within the framework. If anything, the Reserve Bank has been given more resolution powers under the Twin Peak than we actually had previously. High Commissioner Designate. The role of the G20 in sustainable growth, coordinating macroeconomics is difficult, and yet it's one of the easiest things in policy coordination, because you just have monetary authority and the fiscal authority, they come together, they can arrive at something. Coordinating growth is very complex. is like conducting an orchestra. And if you have a bad conductor, you can have horrible music produced from there. Coordinating growth policies at a national level is difficult enough. Trying to coordinate it at an international level, multiple jurisdictions, it's a mammoth task. So what did the G20 do? It came with a framework for strong, balanced, inclusive and sustainable growth framework. And all that we end up having to do is to evaluate each country on whether it is living up to those principles. And I think that is the best you could hope for. The G20 will not be a coordinator of growth outcomes. I can spare you the pain. I can just take the next questions from here. Because it's no point. I'm going to sit there and then you are going to tell me to come back and stand. Let's take it. Okay, Mama, there are two here in the front and one right at the back. And the man I think I recognize, that's number 4. And the white beret at the back is number 5. And Johan van Donner is number 6. That's it.
Let me just speak to you.
Okay, shall we start here, ma'am?
Yes, thank you. I'm the 70th from College of Economic and Management Sciences. The governor said one of your mandate is price stability. And we can all understand that price stability is a component of retailing mostly than commerce. So my concern is, and the governor even mentioned that the bank, or rather financial markets, or rather savings that makes a whole component of banking industry perhaps is from corporate than household savings. Then my question is, as part of when you draft your policies, why are the employees who are in the less favor in terms of by financial markets being forced to get their salaries through the financial markets, in this case banks? Why can't the institutions, I can understand that they belong to corporate savers, why can we have personal cards? Why can our cards, that our salaries be transferred to our cards, and then we go to retailers and then manage our finances there, because retailers favor us employees. And then that's when, because the very same employees are the less favorites of commercial banks, yet we are forced. We never agreed that our money should be taken to banks, but we want to own our money, because you give it as 100 rand as the employer. Me as an employee, I get 80 rands from my own money, and this person who doesn't favor me takes 20 rands of my money, yet they don't even favor me. The retailers on the other side, when they say this item, it costs this.
Ma'am, what is the question?
The question is why? No, I was coming. Can you please not rush me, because I need to clarify this. The question is, why are the salaries taken to banks, not to personal cards?
Okay. I will ask the bank to answer that one. Next, switch off your mic so that the other one can come on.
Thank you, Governor. My name is Chiriz Nenjerere, and I'm chairperson of the department in the College of Economic and Management Sciences. My question is, it's in relationship to what the president has recently said at the University of Johannesburg, and I'm going to quickly read what he said. He said, many more people are going to lose jobs. In the end, despite significant economic progress in the years leading to the global financial crisis, unemployment has increased over the last decades, poverty levels have begun to rise again, millions remain excluded through lack of assets, skills, and networks. My question is, you have indicated in your lecturer that the Reserve Bank has been deemed or possibly accused to be very hawkish in the approach, and you recently cut the interest rate, which might be deemed to have the Reserve Bank having adopted an approach to be dovish in your approach. I want to find out, will there be a continual cut of rates? And if so, what impact will that have on the unemployment rate of South Africa?
Well, I'm not sure what it has to do with the President's code, but be that as it may. At the back, there was the third hand at the back. Can you switch off your microphone? Yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks, Governor. I am Mato Pomoy from UNISA. I've got a simple question to you, Governor. I've got enormous respect for you. However, my question to you is, why you, as a bank, don't you simply embrace the debate of the ownership of the bank by the citizens of the country, by us as the country, in light of the instability that is caused by the very same debate? Now, you have just given us how cheap the shareholders are. It's 200,000, that's what you said, if I get it correctly. President Ramaphosa said we need to suspend the debate of the ownership of the Reserve Bank. The reason we cannot afford it as a country. Now, to me, that is contradictory to what you are just saying now. And then that speaks to the heart of the ownership. At the heart of the ownership, there is an insult debate that says we are not good enough. We cannot be trusted. There is a risk if we own the Reserve Bank. That is the core of the debate that you seem to embrace. You speak like somebody who is captured. Why don't you, as the bank, accept the debate that it is the right thing? After all, there is nothing affordable about the ownership of the bank. And then you start your doctoring of the information. Because the resistance that you are doing right now is further contributing into the instability, which is having a negative impact into the economy. I really don't understand the approach that you are taking. So why can't you embrace the ownership? And then with all the insults that are being dished out of it, because there are insults underlying it. Thank you, Governor.
Right here in the middle.
Some of us own these shares, and we know they are actually, in my portfolio, I should dump these shares. They are not worth that much, return-wise. So let us have the debate and conclude it. And secondly, to then say, why are we shy as we speak about monetary inflation targeting? Why are we shy? I hear sometimes we're talking about what happened into Latin America, the histories of it. We have a horror show across Limpopo here. Why don't we talk about that and say this? We are doing this because we want to avoid this calamity here, amongst other things. This is not the time for us to be sheepish anymore. Let's be frank about matters. Thank you.
Ma'am at the back.
Good day. I'm Mohoshai Msiza from UNISA. My question is, there's a concern of politicians yearning for nationalizing Reserve Bank. And what could be the consequences that will affect South African Reserve Bank, especially when coming to politicians is concerned? And what is it that the politicians don't understand about the proceedings of South African Reserve Bank? That is the question. And then I have a comment. Based on the issue of trust, after what happened to VS Bank, I can declare that our leadership, our political leadership cannot be trusted. And therefore, it's risky for us to have the total ownership or nationalizing the Reserve Bank. Thank you.
Van Tonner.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity, Governor. I think it's more about shifting the conversation to a small...
I can hear you.
Yeah. It's about the tail wagging the dog at this moment in terms of inflation. I don't think the items are getting the attention that it deserves. In other words, it's what I call, or it's my, I made it up, government intervention setting prices. In other words, what I'm talking about here is your health, education. It's all the prices, it's 5 prices comprising 23% of the inflation basket, yet it's responsible for the average inflation rate is around 89%. And the rest of the inflation, the other 77% of the basket, is around 3%. Now you're talking about inflation target. 77% is a 3, the 23% is at 8. So if, to make your job much easier, we need to talk how we're going to get the prices lower, like education, health, water, electricity, those things. If we can get those below 6% or around 6%, interest rates will definitely or can come down easily. To administer prices, if you like. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, that was the last round of questions. There are 6, and we have got to be out of here in 11 minutes. So let's deal with these things. Ma'am, from the College of Management and Sciences, the cards and the retailers, I am not sure I quite understand the question. Money is paid into your bank account because you have a bank account. I'm not sure if your employer would allow it, but I'm sure if you reach an arrangement, it would be fine. That instead of your employer paying the money into your bank account, they pay it into your clothing account because that is who you trust. Because those are the cards. The way in which the national payment system works is that each one of us would have a bank account of some sort. And actually in the National Development Plan, we have set ourselves a target of banking the whole country and raising our financial inclusion target from 80% to 90%. Because that is how a modern system functions. The world over, I participate in something called the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. It's a global phenomenon to get people to be part of a payment system. Because that is what is at the heart. Of course, if you do not want to be in the banking system, it's fine. You can withdraw all your money and place it with the store account. I am not sure that will be the coolest thing to do, but that's the thing. Your neighbor there talks of hawkish, dovish. My knowledge of Avery is not very good. Okay? And I cannot find a single central bank in the world that would be characterized as hawkish permanently or dovish permanently. It's impossible. Like I spelled out, we follow a Taylor rule, and that Taylor rule would necessitate that at particular times when the output gap is closing and inflation is rising, that interest rates tighten. Or if we had seen now where you saw that inflation is contained and the output gap has widened and is negative, then it is time to provide for accommodation. Put simply, monetary policy only manages the fluctuations of output along its long-term trend, but it cannot shift the trend itself. That's all that monetary policy does. It deals with cycles. Kabelo, the paper, thank you very much for that. I'm sure we can do that. The professor here is doing another paper, so it will be very nice to complement all of those. My communication section says, division, say to me that they are doing frequently asked questions on these things, and maybe that will also contribute to that. But yes, correct that we must have the conversation. One day when we are looking for people to work in our Department of International Relations and Cooperation, and you are looking for a job there, come to me for a reference because you are such a good diplomat. Right? The truth of the matter that you wanted to say is that Zimbabwe is experiencing hyperinflation. And the Zimbabweans are poorer from that hyperinflation. That huge rise in inflation didn't create more jobs for the Zimbabweans. Actually, the Zimbabwean economy shared jobs. If anything, the Zimbabwean economy is smaller today than it was 30 years ago as a result of that. So if people want to embark on macroeconomic adventurism, you just have to look at the other side of Limpopo to see what is actually happening. Johan, you're right about the administered prices, but this is also how the thing goes. This is how it goes. So a few of us do not pay for our rates and taxes in the municipality. So the municipality works its revenue model on the basis that they will have a payment rate of 70% or 80%, whatever the figure is. The books must be balanced. What do? They increase the rates for the 70% or 80% that is paying, and that is what ends up being your inflation. And we need a different conversation about administered prices, especially the ones that are set by government. I think that we need a good conversation about that. Isabel, maybe you understand banking better than me. That question, maybe I'm not answering it. Since you are in banking, you might answer it better. The lady at the, did you say you are Mogotladi or Mogoshadi? Mogoshadi. Yes, I'm not sure that I will go to the extent and say that I don't trust politicians. They are my bosses. They are my bosses. I will not venture there. But you didn't get an applause for your statement that said that you must stop this nationalization debate. And the gentleman at the back got an applause because he said you must embrace the debate. And since we are in an academic institution, let me tell you what embracing a debate means. Embracing a debate means not hailing insults. And normally an insult starts by saying, I respect you, and then still insult me. That in an academic institution is not good for a discourse. It's not good for a discourse. When we advance arguments, we need facts and evidence. And that's what I attempted to put in earlier on. But since you misunderstood me because you said that the shares are cheap, they are 200,000, let me put the following facts for you so that you can understand. In 1918, South Africa experienced a banking crisis. At that time, every individual bank issued its own banknotes backed by gold. Some other banks issued more banknotes than they had gold in their vaults. South Africa experienced a banking crisis. And as a consequence of that banking crisis, a decision was taken that we need to establish a central bank that will oversee all of these other banks. That central bank is the South African Reserve Bank, which opened its doors in 1921. Like it happens in many respects, when politicians make a decision about creating something, they create it, and after creating it, they say, where are we going to get the money? So the politicians of the time created the Reserve Bank, but didn't have the money to fund the Reserve Bank. That is the history of private participation in the bank. So the government took a decision to say that we are going to issue shares and get South Africans to put money so that we can create a South African Reserve Bank, because government didn't have the money to capitalize the Reserve Bank. That was the first point. The second point is that the banks that were issuing their own currencies, in lieu of them stopping to produce their own currency, were offered some shares in the bank. And they were given those shares in the bank at that time, cognizant of the fact that banks were the source of the financial crisis in 1918, 1919. And cognizant of that, what was written into the South African Reserve Bank Act was that no individual can own more than 10,000 shares. No individual can own more than 10,000 shares. Which means that no individual can get dividends of more than 1,000 rands a year. 10% of 10,000 rand is 1,000. That is what it was. Some other chaps thought they are clever and decided that I will not just buy shares for myself. I'll buy for my wife, my children, my mother, my father, my father-in-law, and my mother-in-law. And in the process, then the family had a significant number of shares. In 2010, we amended the South African Reserve Bank Act and said that no one, together with their family or associates, would own more than 10,000 shares. And if anybody between them and their family own more than 10,000 shares, they are compliant by law to sell the remainder of the shares. That process eventually got finalized in 2016 through a court order, so that no one would own more than 10,000 shares. And so the debate this started about nationalization of the things is not our debate. Be honest, that debate was driven by that same German shareholder, because he argued that the shares of the Reserve Bank can't be 5 rands a share. He argued that they are closer to 1,200 rands a share. And if you do it on those figures of 1,200 rands a share, then we are talking billions. We are not talking millions or thousands. At the existing share price of about 10 rands, if you were to buy all the shareholders, 10 rand multiplied by 2 million, which is the total shares in issue, will give you 20 million rands. That's what you would pay for. So the figure can vary between 20 million and multiple billions depending on how you value these things. Now, how did the valuation end up coming with this guy saying maybe more than 1,200 a share? Because he argued that the $50 billion of reserves that the South African Reserve Bank holds belongs to them as shareholders. That if you work the net asset value of the bank, that is what they would have to be compensated for. It is not our debate as South Africans, and can we please stop deceiving ourselves and be driven by foreign interests who want to capture our state and then come with an argument with nefarious intentions to try and steer a debate, and we make it as if it is our debate. It is not our debate. It does not belong here. And that is the history of the evolution of these shares. Embracing the debate, come, you can debate with us. Let's debate with facts and not yell insults at each other.
Thank you, Governor. May I request Professor Mohale to walk towards the podium. Mr. Governor, there's a token for you. I don't think you... Is that a degree? No, it's not a degree. We also have tokens for our panel members. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of our session. We already a few minutes above time. I would like to request Professor Thomas Mohale to give the vote of thanks to everyone who's here, including our speaker and members of the panel.
On behalf of UNISA, the College of Economic and Management Sciences, and all academics present here, let me express a word of thanks to the governor, who is extremely busy and yet has found it in his time to come and deliver the lecture here. We are all the better for his presentation. So I'd like to say thank you, Governor, and your team. And you are such a friend of the college, because early this year you came when we had Jens Weidermann, the president of the German Bundesbank. I came to deliver the lecture here. You were here to support the event as well. And so your support for the college and the university does not go unrecognized. I also wish to thank our respondents, our panelists, for taking your time to be here to distill the governor's lecture and throw some light on some of the issues that may be complicated. I know, as with the nature of this kind of discussion, we are likely to have further conversation outside the walls of this hall, and it's a good thing that we have been triggered into this conversation, and then we can discuss issues in a far more informed fashion. Colleagues from different media institutions, from the diplomatic corps, thank you very much for your support. And lastly, I'd like to thank our own college's Department of Marketing and Communication, who have worked tirelessly to make this event possible. They've sent the invitations to all, and some have accepted, as we can see here. It's quite an intensive process in the background, and that we have arrived at this position where we are. I have nothing but to say thanks and praise this team. And lastly, because program director, nobody's going to thank you, I like to thank you for facilitating this so ably and so delicately that we have arrived at this point. But thank you, everyone. We appreciate your presence here. Go well. And when we invite you, come back.